Joining me now, we have Michael McFaul, professor of political science at Stanford University and former U.S. ambassador to Russia. Ambassador, it's always good to see you. So this particular attack, it leads into the statement from Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, who's now saying the war will, quote, end faster under the policies of Donald Trump. What is his reasoning? Do you agree? Or could he just be trying to curry favor?
Well, President Zelensky and the entire Ukrainian government, and frankly, every government I know around the world in Europe and Asia, has been plotting their plan Bs for the event that President Trump would be reelected. So they've been thinking about this for months. And what I see President Zelensky doing is trying to curry favor, to try to say nice things about President-elect Trump. He's read everybody else's playbooks with Trump, and he understands that flattery is important. And now they want to test President-elect Trump at his word. He said that he could end this war in 24 hours before he was even sworn in. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But he said that he has a plan to try to end this war. And I think President Zelensky wants to see if, in fact, that's true.
And he said it would have to be done diplomatically, right?
Well, of course, right now, the discussion in the Trump orbit and people around President-elect Trump, they're all talking about what Zelensky needs to do to end the war. Well, you know, I think President Zelensky's ready to think about concessions. But what he wants President-elect Trump to think about and people around him is what are you going to get Putin to do to end the war? Because let's remember, Putin started this war. Putin invaded Ukraine. Zelensky didn't invade Russia until very late in the war. And I think he's hinting that if there's going to be a deal, an art of the deal, there's got to be compromises on both sides. And they want Trump and his people to start thinking about what they're going to press Putin to do to end the war.
I know you frequently talk with people in Ukraine. What are their feelings about Donald Trump's return to power?
They're nervous. They're very nervous. They worry that he doesn't understand that cutting assistance to Ukraine will not lead to the end of the war in Ukraine. They've seen what people around him, right? I want to keep saying that. They've seen what people around them said. We'll cut aid and the war will be over. They don't believe that. They believe if we cut aid, Putin will try to capture Kiev. And by the way, that's very logical. I study wars. I teach about wars. Wars don't end when one side thinks they're winning and the other side is being disarmed. Wars end in two different ways. Either one side wins or there's a stalemate on the battlefield. If we end our assistance to Ukraine, that is neither of those two conditions. And so they worry that they'll be disarmed, but that won't stop Putin from keeping going. That'll only embolden him.
So you write, you did it this week, saying that President Biden still has the chance to shape his legacy on the Russia-Ukraine war. What is Biden's unfinished business in Ukraine, and does he have time to finish it?
Well, the first thing I said is to give the Ukrainians complete permission to use all of our weapons against Russian targets. There's been some reporting about that. I haven't confirmed it, but that would be the first step. The second, we have seized Russian central bank assets, billions of them. Those should now be delivered to a Ukrainian development fund or the government of Ukraine before President-elect Trump comes back into power, and that would empower the Europeans to do so as well. Third, there's all kinds of things we can do on sanctions. Just sanctioning all of the ships in the so-called, this never land of these gray area ships that Putin is now using to export his oil. Sanction those now. And fourth, declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. I think that should have been done years ago. I would just want to remind your viewers, Cuba is on our list. So I dare anybody to make the argument to me how Cuba is a greater sponsor of terrorism than Russia. But even if you don't believe that, I think doing this would be a chit that Biden could give to President Trump that he could then use in the negotiations. So 4 concrete things that could all be done before January 20th.
I'm going to reveal what you were referring to when you said there are some reports about potentially allowing Ukraine to do just what you said, which is use the full armament of access to military use that we have given them here in the United States. This is coming from the New York Times, the Washington Post, from Reuters, and I want to add that NBC News is working to confirm this independently. But there are the reports that President Biden is allowing Ukraine to strike Russia with long-range missiles. He reportedly has authorized the Ukrainian military to use the systems to help defend its forces in the Kursk region of Russia. So that is, I presume, sir, what you were referring to. And again, NBC News is working to independently confirm this. But there you see our attribution in terms of where those reports are coming from at this point. Let me ask you about your take on Donald Trump's latest staff picks. I want to talk about Tulsi Gabbard, his choice for DNI. She's been accused of being a Russia apologist. In 2017, went to Syria to meet with President Bashar al-Assad. And then you heard Congressman Debbie Wasserman Schultz calling her a Russian asset. Do you really think that she would compromise U.S. intelligence information?
Well, first, before pivoting to the really bad ones, and she's not the only one, I do want to acknowledge that he's made some, I think, very legitimate picks. Senator Rubio, I have disagreements with him about certain aspects of his views about foreign policy, but he was part of my confirmation hearings in 2011. And I remind you of that for two reasons. One, it was a substantive conversation. And two, it was a long time ago. He's been at this for a long time. And if we had more time, I'd say the same thing about Michael Waltz. But this one is troubling for exactly the reasons you just described. I hope the Senate will take very seriously these allegations. I don't know if they're true or not, but most certainly our intelligence community will know if they're true. And then second, even if they're not true, I think this particular nominee needs to understand that this is not a policy-making job. The head of the DNI is about intelligence. The president should not be asking her for her policy advice. And second, we cannot have the politicization of intelligence. That would be a disaster for American national security, including for President Trump. He needs his information to be completely clean of any political views. And I hope if Tulsi Gabbard is confirmed, she understands those two principles. You're not a policymaker, and you're not there to politicize intelligence.
You know, Michael, as we look through this New York Times, Washington Post reporting that you have referenced and that I, illuminated to some degree, if true, how does that change the trajectory of the war? And timing-wise, does it need to be done between today and January 20?
Well, first of all, it should have been done a long time ago. I've never understood why we put these limitations on. There was some alleged fear of escalation that I'd never fully understood. And I'm not privy to secret information, so maybe the Biden administration knew things I didn't, but I never agreed with this.
Can I ask you, was it because Putin threatened NATO and said, if you cross this line, I'm coming after you?
Allegedly, that's one threat that's been out there. And allegedly, he's threatened to use nuclear weapons. And I'm not saying these are easy decisions, but if our goal is to help Ukraine keep as a sovereign country and defend their territory, the idea that Russia can attack Ukraine from Russian bases, but the Ukrainians can't attack those same bases that are attacking them, never made any sense to me. And I would remind everybody, in the United Nations Charter, there's the right to self-defense. But having said that, better late than never. And yes, of course, all these restrictions should be lifted. And I hope the Biden administration is moving all of the pledge assistance to Ukraine as fast as possible so that it is already transferred before we have a transfer on January 20th at the White House.
All right, let's see how all this unfolds. We're definitely going to have you back to talk about that and more. Thank you so much, my friend. Good to see you.